Can you kind of compare and contrast the legal and regulatory landscapes between, traditional aviation and transportation law, and then kind of where we are in with drones and UAS?
Well, I think the most important thing when you talk about, the drone regulation versus the regulation of the other parts of the airspace is that there really isn't any difference. As far as the FAA is concerned, all drones are aircraft. They all have to comply with all of the federal aviation regulations, and on a one-off basis through things like exemptions or waivers or things like that, will allow things to be done that the main rules don't permit. But yeah, again, even with that, we talk about exemptions and waivers, and everybody who's in the drone world, knows that there was this program, the 333 exemptions and things like that, which were aimed specifically at drones. But the fact is that actually is a minor part of a very broad exemption process that the FAA has. And that exemption process, basically any federal aviation regulation, can be waived or you can get an exemption for and you use the same process, that you went through for your 333 exemption. You tell the FAA what you want to do. You tell the FAA what regulations need to be, exempted or changed or modified for you to do it. And then you explain to them why what you're doing is just as safe as if you were following the regulations. It's that equivalent level of safety. And so, that process is used by, helicopter operators and other, large aircraft, small aircraft all the time. If they want to modify an aircraft for, photography or some other, things that you go through basically an exemption type process to be allowed to do those things. So even with that, when we're talking about exemptions and waivers and things like that, it's very much the exact same overlay that the FAA uses for all other aviation work. So, and again, in terms of like enforcement and compliance, there aren't special enforcement and compliance rules for unmanned aircraft. If you do something with your unmanned aircraft that's careless and reckless, you violate the federal aviation regulations around Part 91. You're in the exact same enforcement and compliance system as if you were flying a helicopter or an airliner. It's the exact same regulations, the exact same laws, the exact same enforcement handbook is going to be used by, the enforcement people to determine what the appropriate penalty is going to be. It's the same, appeal process to the ALJ and then ultimately to the NTSB. So again, it's, people who operate drones, sometimes think that they're like in a special compartment.
Right.
But you're not. You're literally in the same system that everybody else is in.
And is that by design, or is that just because that's the easiest way to regulate until we have kind of separate frameworks or separate methodologies to regulate drones?
I think it's actually by design. I think early on, the FAA decided that since drones were going to be treated as aircraft, that the entire airspace system was not going to be modified to basically support them. They had
to accommodate them.
Like anybody else who had an experimental aircraft, you've got to be able to fit into the airspace. They're not going to create a new system just for you. And part of that is also, I think, as a practical matter, the FAA and the aviation industry has spent decades literally trying to establish the principles about federal preemption and federal control of the airspace. And if you treat drones as something separate, that they're not part of the airspace and they're not aircraft, then you run, I think, a greater risk of people saying, well, it should be, there should be less federal control, there should be more state and local, operations. And I think the FAA, both from a safety and philosophical standpoint, said these are aircraft. We're gonna treat them as federal, and we're gonna apply federal law to them under the exact same principles as everything else. So as I said, I think it was intentional, particularly when you look at if you look at the briefing back. I don't know if you guys remember the Perker case. That was probably the first major enforcement action. This was back 2013, 2014. It was Mr. Perker was flying his aircraft at a university. It was University of Virginia, and he actually got cited for careless and reckless behavior, and it went to an ALJ, and he convinced the ALJ that his drone was not an aircraft and therefore was exempt from the federal aviation regulation. And so the FAA, obviously, they appealed that ruling to the NTSB. And so there was a lot of, that was really early on. There's a lot at stake in that case. If they'd lost that case, then basically the FAA would have been without authority to regulate drones, period.
That would be the precedent moving forward.
And so if you read the NTSB's opinion in that case, it's very strong, and makes very forcefully the argument that because these are aircraft, the FAA has complete control over it. So as I said, that was kind of the framework for the FAA's involvement. They were running the risk that basically the entire system of drones would be taken away.
Yeah.
And I think they looked at that as it's not just one of these power grabs. It's, that they think control of the airspace as a unit is necessary for safety. And so they really did not want to lose control of that component of it.